I want to thank Sky Wills for being here to support our webinar and introduce our presenters of our webinar series. Sky, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can introduce the topic and our presenter.
Great, thanks, Sean. So I am very excited to have Amanda Ramcharan here to tell us a little bit about the things she's been working on, bridging some gaps between engineering and soil science. So she's originally from Trinidad and Tobago. She went to Princeton for her undergrad in mechanical engineering, which is different than most of us, I'm going to guess. And then she got her PhD also in engineering, agricultural and biological engineering, so getting a little bit closer from Penn State University. So I started working with Amanda as she's trying to use some of our soil data from Surgo, from the National Cooperative Soil Survey database, and then from the RACA data in order to use in some of the cool data science AI type tools she's using. So I've really enjoyed working with Amanda, and I hope she's going to tell us about all that great stuff in this webinar. So go ahead, Amanda. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Sky. So for this presentation, I'm going to do a quick intro into machine learning, like a flash course, and then talk about my two main projects that I did working with soils data and machine learning algorithms for my dissertation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some future work, some interesting ideas and projects that I would really love to do to progress this work. So we can go on to the next slide. And so the reason that I got interested in AI is there's just a lot of potential for these algorithms, and they're easier and easier to use out there. And in the agricultural sector, there's a lot of impact. So here I have a report from McKinsey that was put out about a year ago on the potential of machine learning algorithms for different industries. And you can see here within agriculture, there's a lot of different areas where it's going to impact and it's going to be very useful. So given this, I sort of went, during my PhD, I really sort of delved into these models to see what they can do within the field. So on the next slide, I just have this graphic here for what I spend most of my time doing. It's actually not running all these models and so on, but there's a lot of time spent on processing the data. And every project I've worked on so far, it's kind of looked like this, where most of the time we're just looking at the data, cleaning the data, processing it, getting it ready for the final analysis. So we can move on to the next slide here. And okay, so what is machine learning? So if there is a feature in the world that you want to predict how it responds to different variables, you have your observations, your x values, and you try to find a map of x onto y. And it's very similar to things that we're familiar with the equation of a line, fitting a line to data. The benefit of machine learning is that there are way less restrictions on the distribution of the input data of the predictor variables that you want to use, and you can also integrate different data types within your predictor variables to better predict your response. So a lot of these algorithms that I use work with numerical data as well as categorical data as well as nominal data all together to get a better prediction. A lot of the work that I did in these projects was also focused on getting the best prediction out there and not necessarily building like understanding the model. There are limitations to machine learning in model interpretation. So the goal of machine learning is generalization, to learn a pattern, trying to get a signal from the noise inherent in gathering data. So we can progress, move on to the next slide. So there are lots of different platforms to do machine learning. For my dissertation, I worked mostly in R, and I linked it to GIS and Google Earth to do some of the mapping. My current postdoctoral position, I work with Python and TensorFlow. TensorFlow is Google's open access machine learning platform. All the work that I do is using open access platforms, and there are a lot of them out there, and they're definitely becoming easier and easier to use. So there's a lot of variety out there, and the reason that I chose R for my dissertation, it was a language that was easy for me to collaborate with my collaborators on. So everyone was familiar with R, so that worked really well. Okay, so we can move on. Next slide. Okay, so the first project I'm going to talk about is building a soil bulk density function with machine learning algorithms. So there are a lot of header transfer functions that already exist to predict bulk density because it's very hard to measure. There are limitations to measuring bulk density in the field, and many soil scientists have developed functions that estimate bulk density. But as we get bigger and bigger data sets, and we can move on to the next slide, the trend has been towards nonparametric methods, another term for machine learning algorithms that can handle these bigger and bigger data sets and still have a high performance in how well they estimate bulk density. So again, it's not necessary, but the difference is there's no longer going to be an equation at the end of the model. It's just a pattern recognition model. So I'm seeing that the audio is cutting in and out, so I'm going to try to have my phone a little bit closer.
The audio sounds strong for us here.
Okay. Okay. All right, so we can go on to the next slide. All right, so for this first project, I wanted to create a bulk density model that can be used for the conterminous US, and then I wanted to test how well this bulk density header transfer function can be used to estimate bulk density to calculate soil organic carbon stocks. So I started off with the NCS's characterization data set from 2015. There were over 200,000 observations. There were about 40,000 with bulk density data, so that's what I worked with. And here I have some of the geolocations of the head-ons that were used, as well as the actual soil samples at the National Soil Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we can progress to the next slide. So the features that I wanted to collect to connect to the soil data were features that were representative of the 5-factor model of soil formation. For this, I did not have any features that were representative of time for this model. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, this has a graphic, so we can just click through it. So I had environmental data sets that I stacked, and some examples are superficial materials from the USGS, as well as ecosystem spatial data. And then I overlaid those onto the soil observations. So all the observations had geolocations. And I used that to create a regression matrix. And now with that regression matrix, I can start to fit different machine learning models and test them to see which one was the best fit. And here are some examples of different models. I sort of went from simple to more complex. So the final model that I chose for this was a random forest model. And this model is called an ensemble model, and because it is a collection of decision trees. So a number of trees make a forest, that's why it has a name. So instead of relying on one type of decision tree, it relies on a group of decision trees that all come together. Each decision tree has a prediction, and then it aggregates prediction and gives you the average. So for this, I started off with, to build a tree, it takes a random subsample of the data set and chooses predictors to build a tree that minimize the regression error. And it continues to make splits in the decision tree until it minimizes the error. So you have a number of trees, and then you send an observation down every tree. It gives you an estimate, and then the entire random forest gives you the average of all of those estimates. So for the petatransfer function that I built, it had 150 trees, and it was able, the variance explained was about 66.7%. And out of all the environmental predictors that I put into the model, the final number of variables to predict the bulk density was 10. Keep going. So this is sort of the code that was implemented to build the model. So here we have our some soil properties, and you can click through and you can see the definitions. So we have organic carbon, we have texture, which is similar to a lot of other petatransfer functions, and pH. We also have the horizon designation, and we also have the structure type and size, which were our categorical variables to describe the different horizons. We have province, which is an ecoregion categorical variable, as well as the superficial materials that were used in building the petatransfer function. So here we have, for the validation data, what the overall fit of the model for looking at its predictions compared to the measured bulk density. And here we can see, like most models, it sort of overestimates the low bulk density values, and then it underestimates the high values. But where most of the data lies within the 1.25 to 1.75 bulk density range, it does a pretty good job there. And the outliers is where it kind of is, the performance isn't as good. So this is how the model performs to other petatransfer functions, machine learning petatransfer functions out there, and you can see that the error is in line with these other models, but I was able to use a lot more data for my bulk density model. Now, looking at the predictor variables that were used in the model, I was able to plot how these variables relate to the response, the bulk density response. And in the top left, I see there's a strong relationship here between bulk density and soil organic carbon. And also on the top right, there's sort of a maximum percent clay related to bulk density. But there wasn't as strong, to me anyway, a relationship between the sand and bulk density or the depth. So yeah, so you could start to kind of analyze the bulk density model a little bit, making sure it corresponds to what we already know and what's familiar in the soil science world. Okay, so then I went through an example of how we can actually apply this bulk density model to estimate something like soil carbon. And here I have an example of 4 pedons going from, across the U.S., going from a cold, wet environment to a hot, dry environment. And these already had bulk density measurements within the data set. So these are the actual measured carbon stocks from that. And then if you click through, you see if I were to calculate the bulk density with my model to estimate the soil carbon, these are what the estimated values would be. And you can see it does a pretty good job, but sort of in the extremes, it's not as good, but it's pretty close. So in terms of an application of this model, it did a pretty good job. So moving on to my next project that I did was to create soil property and class maps for the U.S. So I did this at 100-meter pixel resolution. So traditional sort of mapping is based on in the U.S. it's based on the soil map unit that's composed of different components, but it's not necessarily spatially explicit where these soil components are, and it requires a lot of expert knowledge, local expert knowledge to prepare the data in a spatially explicit way. So I was sort of inspired by the next map with soil grids. Where did it go? Right, here where there's spatially explicit maps, because one of the things that I'm interested in is using the soils data as input into ecological models. So with this, it makes it a lot easier for non-soil science, non-soil scientists, non-expert in soils to use this data and integrate it into their model. But soil grids is at a 1 kilometer resolution. It's a very large resolution. And because it's a global model, it doesn't use a lot of the national data sets that the U.S. has available. So here I have some examples of higher resolution national environmental variables, covariates, that can be input into and build a better soil map. So here I have elevation, we have some satellite data, just to give you a couple of examples. So we also use Sergo variables such as drainage class and parent material. And I sort of put together a much bigger environmental covariate data set to build a soil property model and soil class models for the U.S. So we can just click through. So again, I overlaid this onto, there were 3 different soils data sets available to use. And again, I built the regression matrix, and then we started to build machine learning models. And we used, again, the random forest model and the XGBoost model. Again, the principle of ensemble modeling, that more models are better than one. And then we fit the models and then created a map. And then what we would do with our collaborators is send these maps out, have them look at it, see if there are any artifacts and any problems, if things make sense and so on. And we would go through that loop a couple of times to improve the predictions of the model. So we did this about 4 times before the final results for the paper. So here we have, on the left, the soil properties that we predicted at 100-meter pixel resolution, and we did this for 7 standard depths. And then on the right, we have 2 soil classes that we mapped at 100-meter pixel resolution. So we have Great Group. We had about over 200 categories for Great Group, and then the modified particle size class, which is pretty much particle size class, but with a couple of more categories to make better use of the data. So here are some examples of the soil property maps that were made, and this is at 1 depth, but we have them for 7 depths. And here are some of the performance metrics for these national models. And the best performing model was the pH. It had an overall root mean squared error of 0.74, which is pretty good. One of the things that I was surprised about was that the texture, the sand and clay models, didn't look as good as I would have expected. The root mean square error for sand was pretty high. And there's a lot of, we had a lot of data available there for that. And then the soil grade group and particle size classification accuracy was about 60 and 66%. I think the particle size model did a lot better because there are also a lot less categories for that class, for that model. So I think it's not necessarily a fair comparison there. But you could kind of start to see, okay, what are the performance metrics for a national scale model? So here I have the variable importance plots for each soil property model. And for this, I want to sort of emphasize that I wouldn't focus on interpreting these variables as some sort of national importance for that given soil property. The emphasis was to get the best prediction of the soil properties, but there are a lot of correlated variables here. And these variable importance plots aren't really as useful when you have a lot of correlated variables. So the variable importance plots would change depending on which of these variables I removed or left in. So, but this is standard reporting procedure for the machine learning world when we're using these types of models, so I wanted to include it for it to be complete, but we tried not to over-interpret these plots. Okay, so here I have some examples as well as just like highest probability soil class maps for each class category, class name within a category. We also have a probability map of the probability of that class for each pixel. So for example, in the top right corner for fragi orthods, we have, going from the light to dark, the probability of a fragi orthod at that pixel. And on the left, I have a map from a paper that was done in 2015 on soils with fragipans in the U.S. and their spatial distribution. And these two projects kind of have started with the same data set. But you can see the similarities here of the maps that we produce compared to this independent work here. So the spotted sol fragipans, and an example of that, we have the fragi orthods, and they're up in the northeast and over in Michigan. And then with the inceptisol fragipans, you can see their distribution again in the northeast. This could move forward. We have now the ultrasol fragipans and then the alphasol fragipans examples here. So even though we're not, it's a much more difficult model to interpret and to understand. To me, it's really promising when I see these distributions corresponding to other independent research that was done to map these soil types. Another thing that I'm interested in looking at is we can start to compare the soil property maps to the categorical data that we have. So on the left, we have the probability map of clayey soil, which is a particle size classification. And then we also have the percent clay map on the right. And I think it's really interesting to start to think of to start to quantify these categorical variables. So when we say a clayey soil in the Midwest, what does that mean compared to a clayey soil, say, in the Northeast or the Southwest? Okay, so this is sort of our end product. So we started off with sort of these traditional soil map units, and this is an example of a soil map unit out in Utah. And we have the different soil components, but now we have a gridded clay map that now you can see spatially within a soil map unit where there's higher clay content in the soil and lower clay content. And we hope that this can be another way that we represent soil information that's useful for people who really need that spatial context. Okay, so there are a lot of limitations to this approach, and I wanted to kind of talk about some of them. The soil samples that we worked with, there's not an even sampling across the U.S. A lot of these samples came from agricultural soils, and much less came from forested regions. So there is more uncertainty in the predictions in forested areas compared to agricultural soils. We had to make a lot of decisions on how to use information from places like Surgo to build the type of data that would fit into a machine learning model. So, for example, in order to get the parent material, we went with the most, so we got that, we worked with Sharon Waltman to get that parent material map, but each soil component could have a different parent material. So do we just take the most frequent one, or we do a weighted sampling? We had to do a lot of distilling of the data to create inputs to the machine learning model. And then the validation of the map. So we have some independent data that was used in our paper that is, a lot of it is from the Western U.S., and it's what we could get, but it's just an initial start. It was very hard for us to try to get independent data sets. And when we finished this, we weren't able to do sort of an uncertainty analysis at the resolution, at 100-meter resolution across the U.S. Now there are tools to sort of explore the prediction intervals for each value that we predict within a pixel. So just as in the random forest example, how we had each decision tree gives you an estimate, we can sort of get the range of estimates now for every pixel and to map that. So then you could start to get a better idea of the certainty of each prediction at a pixel. And I think that would sort of highlight where we have a lot of soil samples that can give a stronger prediction versus where we're really missing a lot of data. So future work. So we can click forward. One of the things that I'm really interested in is moving this over to a really, really optimized machine learning platform and getting these models compressed and then running in a browser so we can easily update these models. We can easily share these models and for people to better see how these maps are made. So here I have TensorFlow, which is Google's machine learning platform, and they recently launched their machine learning platform with JavaScript. So you can host these models and share them in a browser, which I think would be a really great tool for helping people understand how machine learning works and how these models and maps are made. Another thing that I'm interested in is using these models as input for local models and higher resolution local maps. So again, going from using the models that we've created as input as an inference, and then as you get new data and new input, you aggregate all of that to give you the best prediction at a much higher resolution scale, but maybe just for like a local watershed or local region. And then finally, everything's going mobile. So, and a mobile device has a lot more sensors, and they're much more common now on landscape is a much easier tool to access. So how can we harness some of these sensors in mobile devices to validate these maps or collect more data? One second. So, okay. So with that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators that have worked with me throughout this project. And yeah, that's all I got. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, we'll give people a moment to compose their questions and put it in the Q&A. And we do have a few questions already have come in, so we'll start with those.
Okay.
Curtis writes, how important is randomness to your conclusions? PET-on data were gathered by targeting soil series.
Okay, can you just repeat that question? How
important is randomness to your conclusions? Because the PET-on data were gathered by targeting soil series.
Yeah, so I think it's, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as randomness, but I describe it more as there is bias in the data set. So, and the models are going to perform better in areas that were sampled more heavily than areas that weren't. So I think the way that I think of it is not necessarily randomness, but this bias in the sampling scheme, and the model is also going to reflect that bias, if that makes sense.
All right, and Steph puts in, what are the variables SG_clay and SG_SOC, SG_BD?
So those are inputs from the soil grid's 1 kilometer data set. So we use that as an initial prediction, as an initial inference, and then we added all of the national environmental covariates and then built a new model at a higher resolution. So SG just represents the soil grid's 1 kilometer map that we used. Their inference was first input into the model.
And a follow-up question, what do you make of the depth variable being one of the most significant variables for the soil property model?
Yeah, so I think that has to do with, so they're three-dimensional, and the biggest, it was just the most important predictor when you wanted to go at depth. There were so many, depth correlates with so many different environmental variables, it just pulled out as the strongest variable within the model.
All right, another question from Jay Wood. Can you describe how you performed the validation?
Yeah, so the validation was, let me see, let me bring it up here. So the soil property map, so it was a tenfold cross-validation. What we did was we did a 90-10 training testing data split, and we did that 10 different times. And to sort of be as independent as possible, we removed all the soil grid environmental variables from the model, as well as if a PET-on was used to build a model, the horizon from that PET-on was not used to test the model. So it was split based on the training test that was done based on location. So we did that. We trained one model on 90% of the data and then tested it on 10% and then did that 10 times to get an overall average performance metric.
Okay, and another question from TD. How many predictors did you start with for bulk density modeling effort?
Oh, okay. I think I started with around about 80 different variables, and then narrowed down from that. A lot of them, which was pretty easy to do, a lot of them weren't as important as I expected them to be.
Hey, Amanda, this is Sky. I have a question for you. If you could go back and start again, what would you do different?
Oh, so for either one of these projects?
Just pick one. Maybe you have thoughts.
What would I do different? So that's the thing. So every time I look at the machine learning world is progressing so quickly. There's so many more tools out there, more metrics out there, and it's just like I feel like my work is already outdated. So I think there are all these new, especially when you're thinking about validation and exploring the model, there's a lot more out there that I want to do and sort of dig into the data a bit more and to get better ways to express like how these maps were built and where the uncertainty, the spatial uncertainty of the map is. So I don't necessarily think I would like redo anything, but there's just so many more tools available now that I can do so much more.
Sure.
All right, there's another question from Jason that also boils down to, does more data equal better models? He says, for the pedo transfer function for bulk density compared to other models, increased sample size of your model did not yield improved performance. A stated benefit of machine learning is the ability to use more data. How to square the lack of performance benefit with increased sample size and the motivation to use more data?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the models and the performance as an overall, it's kind of hard to see the improvement in performance as you add more data. But when you start to split your model performance up based on, say, for the bulk density, I did it by horizon. And then for the property maps, I did one based on regions within the U.S. Then you start to see where the models do a better job and where they do a worse job. And then you can sort of target where you want more data. And then you can see your improvement. But I think when you're looking at it as overall aggregate, it's hard to distill. So for example, in the bulk density, I had the least number of samples in the C horizon. Wait, no, actually, yeah, C horizon had low number of samples, but also the O horizon had a low number of samples. So if we got more data there, it would definitely be a lot better. But when you look at it as an overall, you don't necessarily see that.
And a follow-up question, any evidence for regional trends in bulk density residual?
Sorry, can you repeat that last question? I can't.
Any evidence for regional trends in bulk density residual?
So the trends that I saw were more in like horizons. So the B horizon was the best. The B horizon bulk density estimates were the best because the most samples that I had were from the B horizon. So I saw the trend in residuals based on horizon.
All right, there's another one from Miles. Maybe I missed it during the presentation, but when utilizing DSM and machine learning, where can we get this data from? Or are they having to build the data before they can utilize it in machine learning? Can you just talk about where you got the sources of data? Yeah,
so I started off with the Microsoft Access version of the NCS's characterization dataset, which is available on the NRCS website. And all the data, all the environmental covariates that I got are publicly available data sets from government agencies or from research labs.
And was it just available on a website, or did you have to make contact with somebody at these other government agencies?
Yeah. So most of it was Yeah, most of the variables I got were all available on websites.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, Amanda, thank you for your time and effort to make this presentation, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had well over 100 people in today's webinar. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our center's YouTube channel within a few days, so feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. This concludes our webinar presentation.